This is a three-part video series for Luthier, which describes using the bandsaw and the Accu-Slice system to produce these book-matched panels for the sides and backs of guitars and other stringed instruments. The Accu-Slice system enables the resawing of boards on a bandsaw with no blade drift issues and with perfectly flat and parallel sides, and sliced to a tolerance of better than plus or minus 0.02 of an inch. With this technique, boards can be resawn or sliced with minimal wood waste, and it's much safer than using a bandsaw with conventional fence, since with this technique, your hands are far removed from the bandsaw blade. I made this my first Spanish classic guitar more than 50 years ago when I was just 19. I've been woodworking and making furniture for about 4 years at that time, working with my father whose hobby was making grandfather clocks. I've been playing the accordion since I was around 7 years old and decided I wanted to learn how to play the guitar. So I decided to make my own Spanish classic guitar. I purchased this book by A.P. Sharp, which guided me through the process of making this guitar. All the panels for the top, sides, and back for this guitar were cut from 3/4 inch stock lumber on a radial arm saw, which was not only dangerous but wasted a lot of wood. I learned a lot making this guitar, including carving of the neck, doing the inlaying of the rosette, doing the banding and purfling, and steam bending the wood to make the sides of the guitar. So it was a great learning experience. In addition, I made a lot of my own jigs in order to assemble this guitar. In this video series, I will demonstrate the accurate cutting of book-matched panels that can be used as the backs and sides for guitars or other projects using the Accu-Slice system on the bandsaw. In this Part 1 video, I will describe the Accu-Slice system and demonstrate its advantage over resawing using a conventional bandsaw fence. I will describe the Accu-Slice system, demonstrate how to set up the system on the bandsaw, demonstrate how to mount boards on the Accu-Slice Carriage, and describe bandsaw blade selection to get the optimum cuts with the least amount of wood loss. I will demonstrate that it's possible to slice boards as thin as 0.010 of an inch with parallel sides and minimal bandsaw blade marks. In Part 2 of this video series, I will demonstrate the slicing of 5-inch tall by 32-inch long book-matched panels that can be used for guitar sides. I will be slicing 0.125-inch thick panels from a variety of woods including maple, walnut, cherry, wenge, and padauk. I will evaluate several bandsaw blades to determine what size is the optimum for slicing these boards. Finally, after cutting the boards, I'll run them through a board sander to determine how much wood needs to be sanded off to obtain finished smooth surfaces on both sides of the panels. In Part 3 of this video series, we will follow the format of Part 2, but we'll be cutting wider boards measuring 8.25 inches tall by 22 inches long to produce the book-matched back panels for the guitars. Again, I will be cutting a variety of woods in this video, including maple, mahogany, wenge, and cherry. After I completed these 3 videos on slicing the book-matched panels for guitar backs and sides, I summarized the results of what I learned in a 4th video entitled Lessons Learned and Tips for the Accu-Slice System. Here's a list of the topics that will be discussed and demonstrated in this video. It includes lessons learned during the production of these 3 videos, plus additional tips from many of my previous project videos. When cutting boards on the bandsaw, it is very difficult to get perfectly flat, straight boards with no excessive saw marks and burn marks on your surface of your board. In many cases, when you're cutting boards, you cut them thicker than you need so you can run them through a planer or a sander to get rid of the saw marks and get perfectly straight and flat boards. And that's due to a number of reasons. First of all, when you're cutting a board using a fence, you're pushing that board against the fence, you're pushing the board down against the table, at the same time you're pushing the board through the blade. As a result, any change in movement, either hand pressure change, body position changing, the wood moving, any of those issues will cause blade drift. And the reason it happens is because your bandsaw blade, the teeth create a curve. That curve is wider than the back edge of the blade. And if you were to push that board perfectly straight through the bandsaw blade and not move it at all laterally, you'll get perfect boards with no blade drift issues. But as soon as you have any sort of movement of that wood, the teeth of the blade create the curve, the back edge. As soon as that touches the side of the curve, you get blade drift issues. And what happens is you're pushing a board through, maybe the wood moves the slightest amount, the back edge touches the side of the kerf, you start to get movement, you twist it back to push it back the other direction. It touches the kerf of that blade on the opposite side, and you get this, wavy blade drift issues you normally would see. But if you can push that straight through the bandsaw blade, you would not see those issues. But you do get those issues because in this case you have a big board, much bigger than a table. You can get movement this way, you get movement this way, hand pressure changing, body position changing. Any of those conditions will cause that board to move, and as soon as the board moves, you get blade drift issues. As a result, when you're cutting boards, you typically cut them thicker than you need, and then you run them through a planer to get rid of the saw marks and to get the boards perfectly flat. In addition, there's the safety issues. Your hands are right here, right next to that blade, especially when you're cutting thinner boards. So it is a safety issue. You have to be very careful you don't get your hands near that bandsaw blade, because this is a very dangerous piece of equipment. I've mounted my Accu-Slice system on the bandsaw to show you the difference between cutting with the Accu-Slice system and conventional cutting using a fence on a bandsaw. The Accu-Slice system incorporates a rail and a carriage. And this carriage has roller bearings on the base, and these roller bearings ride on this channel on the rail to give you perfectly straight, even movement of the board through the bandsaw blade. This is much like a sawmill in which they mount a log on a carriage and run it through a blade to cut your logs. It's the same concept. Because this board is moving perfectly straight and parallel, there's no lateral movement of that wood whatsoever, and as a result you get no blade drift issues. And the way this works is you have your blade, again, creating a kerf. That kerf is wider than the back edge of the blade. The board's going perfectly straight through the wood. The back edge of the blade never touches that kerf side of the wood as you're cutting, and as a result you get no blade drift issues. You get perfectly straight, flat boards that are perfectly straight with parallel sides. In fact, the boards are so perfect, there's no need to run these boards through a planer to get them to the exact thickness you need. You may want to run them through a sander to get rid of some minor saw marks, but by selecting appropriate number of teeth on your bandsaw blade and cutting slowly, you can even reduce that even further. And I'll be showing that later in the videos. In addition, the system incorporates an index wheel, so I can dial in the exact thickness of the board I want. So if I want two backs for my guitars, exactly 125 thousandths of an inch thick, I just dial in 125 thousandths, cut my first board, dial in again, cut my second board, and those two boards will be accurate to one another within 1 or 2 thousandths of an inch. Extremely accurate. In addition, there's a safety issue. Instead of doing this with your hands right next to the bandsaw blade, your hands are back here, nowhere near that bandsaw blade. So it's a much, much safer way of cutting wood on the bandsaw. There's videos on our website which describe in detail how to install the Accu-Slice system. The Accu-Slice system consists of 3 components: an index table, a rail, and a carriage. And the index table mounts on the bandsaw table just by dropping this miter bar in the miter bar slot. And then there's 3 1/4 turn offset cam screws that lock it in place. That installs the table. And for this project we're using the 5-foot rail, 60-inch rail, which just mounts on 2 pins and then 3 screws to hold it in place. The rail is attached to the index table using 3 1/4 inch diameter, 20 thread per inch Allen head screws. The next component is the carriage, and the carriage has roller bearings on the base, and these roller bearings ride on these outer rails on this rail. And next we have to attach our board with the sacrificial fence we'll be screwing it to this plate. In order to cut boards on the Accu-Slice system, the boards must be mounted to a carriage on the Accu-Slice system, either a 12-inch carriage such as this, or a 24-inch carriage such as this. Both of these carriages have roller bearings on the base. These roller bearings ride on the rail on the Accu-Slice system, and this is the reason you get nice smooth cuts, because there's no lateral movement of that wood on the bandsaw as it's being cut. Now you could mount the board directly to the carriage, but there's two problems that might occur here. First of all, if you use screws, you might be cutting into the screws, but more importantly, you don't want to be cutting into this piece of aluminum with your bandsaw blade. So our preference is to use what we call a sacrificial fence, which is nothing more than a piece of MDF or plywood, gets attached to this carriage with screws, and then you attach your board to the sacrificial fence. If you've seen some of my early videos, you've seen I use double-sided tape to attach the board to the sacrificial fence. This is what we call X-Fasten tape. You can buy it on Amazon. We tested about a dozen tapes in a study we did previously, and the tapes we tested, this is the best tape for holding boards to the sacrificial fence. And it works great for doing small boards, and even round small discs I've done with this technique. However, if you do longer boards, some problems occur. With long boards, the board may not be perfectly flat, may have a bow or twist in it, and then you start cutting it. It relieves some stress in the board, some additional movement of the wood occurs, and as a result the board breaks away from the double-sided tape and you get inaccurate cuts. So I prefer not to use double-sided tape for long boards. Works great for small boards, but not for long boards. The other disadvantage of the tape is you've got to be careful you don't cut into the double-sided tape with your bandsaw blade. You cut into the tape, it gums up your blade and you have a messed up blade. So if we're doing long boards, my preference is to glue the board directly to the piece of MDF. And if you've seen some other videos on doing some of the other projects I've done, I've used this technique a lot. And the advantage of it is the board does not move. Once it's attached to that fence with usually Type-On glue or even CA glue, it stays permanently on there. You can cut your boards, cut your pieces off. The board doesn't move, and I cut all the way down right to the MDF board. So that technique works pretty good. The other technique I've used, I've created some custom fences. This is a fence made again from MDF with some offset cam clamps. And this is just a system for doing a quick release clamping a board. And this works nice if you just have a board you want to cut one or two slices off, but not cut the whole board down, and you don't want to glue it to a piece of MDF. The disadvantage of this system is you have a 1/4 inch here you can't cut down to. So if I wanted to cut this whole board the whole way down, this is not the preferable way to cut the board down. I prefer to actually glue it to an MDF sheet. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different in this video. I'm going to be gluing my board to the MDF sheet, but before I do that, I'm gluing some of these thin strips to the MDF sheet. These are some scrap strips. They're about 100,000 inch thick. I'm putting 2 of these spaced on the MDF sheet, and then I'll be gluing my board right to these strips. This is actually a piece I'll be using to make some guitar backs, or excuse me, guitar sides, and I'll glue it right to those strips, and I can cut the whole way down to those strips. The advantage of this system is I can cut the whole way down to the very end of the board and actually cut into the strips and not cut into the MDF. When you cut into the MDF, you create a lot of sawdust, and also because you have a lot of tension on the MDF sheet, the blade can move on you, so it's not a preferable way to cut the whole way down to the very, very end. But this will work nice. I'll be able to cut the whole way down and get every ounce of wood from my board. Something else to keep in mind when you're cutting your boards, you never want your board overhanging your MDF sacrificial fence. If that board overhangs either on the side or the top, you can get vibration. And what happens is, it may work fine for the first couple cuts, but as the board starts getting thinner and thinner, it'll move and get vibration. And as soon as you get vibration out here, that wood moves and you get inaccurate cuts. So always want that board supported by a sacrificial fence, either the length and also the height. I'm ready to glue this board. This is a board that's walnut, about 2 inches thick, 5 inches by 32 inches for some guitar sides. So I'm going to glue it to this sacrificial fence with the wood strips on it. I normally glue my boards to the MDF sacrificial fence using either Type-On 2 or Type-On 3 glues. I clamp the board with either C-clamps or parallel clamps and allow it to set and cure for at least 1 hour. Let that dry for about an hour and it'll be ready to go. For this project cutting these guitar backs and sides, I'll be using 1/2 inch wide blades between 6 and 10 teeth per inch. My preference is always to use the 1/2 inch wide blades when I'm ripping boards. The reason for that is a 1/2 inch wide blade has a kerf of 45 thousandths of an inch, where a 3/4 inch wide blade has a kerf of 55 thousandths. And a carbide tooth blade even has a wider kerf. You know, the smaller the kerf, the less wood you waste. So that's why I prefer the 1/2 inch wide blades. I'm also using blades between 6 and 10 teeth per inch. Whenever possible, I like to use the most number of teeth per inch that I can, because the more teeth per inch, the smoother the cut. But also, the more teeth per inch, the faster the blade gums up. So you're always compromising, you know, smooth as the cut versus gumming up with a blade when you're selecting a blade for your project. So woods like maple and walnut on the guitar sides, I think I can use a 10 teeth per inch. When I go to woods like padauk and rosewood, I probably have to use maybe 8 teeth per inch. Also, when I'm cutting the guitar backs, which is a thicker piece of wood, I need to go to less teeth per inch because it'll gum up the blade more quickly. So I'm cutting the guitar backs, I'll be using between 8 and 6 teeth per inch blades. And again, it depends on the woods. Woods like, you know, rosewood and padauk gum up quickly, whereas woods like walnut and cherry and maple, you know, I can get away with 10 teeth per inch for cutting these guitar sides. And before I start, I make sure I clean my wheels thoroughly. I usually use a piece of coarse steel wool and just clean the tires on the wheels to make sure there's no residue left from the previous cutting. And I always like to use sharp blades. If you try to get away using an old dull blade, you're going to get poor results. And when you put a new blade on there, you'll see the difference right away. So I tend to go through a lot of blades because I don't waste time and money on, you know, not using an old dull blade. So I always use a sharp blade, you get better results. And also when you're cutting, cut slowly. The slower you cut, the smoother the cut. When you're cutting on the bandsaw, if you can push that wood through very slowly, that gives it more time for the blade to clean out and not gum up. Also, the slower you cut, the smoother the cut. The blade can actually be acting like a planer as you're cutting the board if you cut very slowly. So the trick is to cut slowly and you get your best results. Okay, I'm ready to attach my walnut board here on a sacrificial fence to the carriage. What I typically do is underneath the sacrificial fence to put a thin spacer. Like as soon as I don't want this thing riding on here and binding as it's being cut. So I usually use a 20 thousandths or between 10 and 20 thousandths spacer underneath the sacrificial fence just to keep it off the table while I screw it in place. And these boards I'm cutting are 32 inches long, which is pretty much the limit on this 60-inch sacrificial fence. So I'll make sure I center it. And then I usually pre-drill some holes. Later in both videos 2 and 3 of this series, on resawing these longer and wider boards, I revised this operation. I mounted the sacrificial fence and board being cut so that they rode on the surface top of the bandsaw table. I found that this reduced vibration and produced smoother cuts. In order to assure that the boards and sacrificial fence did not bind or move during attaching them to the carriage, I clamped the sacrificial fence and board to the carriage before drilling the pilot holes and screwing it to the carriage. This is shown and described in video 4. So now we're all ready to start cutting our boards. I'm ready to cut this piece of walnut to make some guitar sides. And the first thing I do is I set my gauge to 0 as a starting point. And then I move it until it just touches the bandsaw blade, move it back, and I'll advance it a little bit to make an initial cut. And the purpose of this first cut is just to remove an outer surface here to give me a nice parallel surface from which to cut the remaining boards. Because I want this first cut to give me a nice flat parallel sides, and then every subsequent cut to that will be perfectly straight and parallel to that cut. So I lock in my coarse adjustment knobs, lock my table to the bandsaw table with the mag jig clamps. I can lower my blade guide a little bit here. Don't lower it too much because I'm going to be able to see what we're doing. Usually I take it down pretty low. And ready to make this first cut to square the board off. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'll be cutting slowly. The slower you cut, the smoother the cut. So what you're trying to do here is use that bandsaw blade to actually plane the wood as you're cutting it. So this is a 10 teeth per inch, 1/2 inch wide blade, and I'm cutting this walnut board and cutting very slowly. What I'm showing here is the actual speed that I normally cut when I'm slicing these boards. As I said, it's a very slow process. The slower you cut, the smoother the cut. And later in the video, I'll speed it up so you don't waste a lot of time watching me cut this board. And you can see the finish on that board. It's pretty smooth. Now just to show you what the capacity of the system is, I'm going to cut a real thin board. What I have here is my index wheel. So in order to cut a board, I first of all release my mag jig clamps. I know my curve of my blade is between 45 and 50 thousandths. So one revolution of this index wheel is 50 thousandths of an inch. That's the curve of my blade. Now I'm going to try cutting a board that's going to be like between 10 and 15 thousandths inch thick. So let me go 5, 10. This is something you could not do with using a fence. Okay, here's that thin piece of wood coming off that piece of walnut. You can see how flexible it is. I could bend that into a small circle quite easily. Let's do some measurements on it, see what we have. There's 12 thousandths, 11 thousandths, 11 thousandths, 10 thousandths. On the other side, 11 thousandths, 11 thousandths, 12 thousandths, 12 thousandths. That's something you couldn't do using a fence. That board's be right around 10 thousandths of an inch thick. It's very parallel, very straight. Minimal marks on the surface from the bandsaw blade. That could be used to glue up right away to make a veneer strip. Well, this concludes part 1 of this video series. This will be a 3-part series. This part 1 describes the basic operation of the system, how to set it up. And video 2 will cover the cutting guitar sides from a variety of woods with some different bandsaw blades of different teeth per inch. And in video 3 we'll cover the slicing of guitar backs, again with some coarser teeth blade because they're thicker boards. After I completed these 3 videos on slicing the book match panels for guitar backs and sides, I summarized the results of what I learned in a 4th video entitled Lessons Learned and Tips for the Accu-Slice System. Here's a list of the topics that will be discussed and demonstrated in this video. It includes lessons learned during the production of these 3 videos, plus additional tips from many of my previous project videos. Here's a set of Wenge book matched side and back panels that were produced in this video series. For additional information and videos on the Accu-Slice system, please go to our website. And once again, thank you for watching this video. If you have any additional questions or concerns, please give us a call or drop us an email. We'd be glad to talk with you.